So like Laura said in the beginning, we know each other for a long time, actually. We have a mutual friend. It's my childhood friend. She decided to go to architecture and I went to study law. And I never really thought that those two things had a lot in common. I never explored those connections. But since Laura moved to Denver and I'm in Boulder, we have connected and talked a lot about our researches. And I've been researching, and let me introduce myself to some of you who don't know me. I just finished my doctorate in law, focused on cooperatives, economic democracy, and solidarity. And I've been working with Elias as the managing editor of Ownership Matters. And Laura and I started talking about the city planning and the problems we see happening that are deeply rooted in our economic system. And Laura was recommending a book called The Capital City from Samuel Stein. At the time she was reading that, and we started discussing and really reflect upon our experiences in the urban space. As a background, I will have to move from my current apartment because it was sold. And this displacement has been happening on a large scale throughout the country. I know a lot of people who has been able have to move because real estate is just skyrocketing. Prices are so high, and this is systematic. And most places we are seeing a phenomenon that working people cannot afford to live where they work, close to work, and where they establish most of their relationships. And the city is this incubator of all these ideas, all this differences among people. People has their own projects, and everybody's living in the same region, the same area, with their own expectations, their own needs and demands. And how we organize all of that, and how can we do that in a way that is protective and centered around people. And this is the largest challenge right now. And just through personal experiences recently, I traveled to Maui in Hawaii, and displacement has been happening in a large scale in the island, where locals cannot afford to live in the islands anymore because it's so expensive as a reflection of tourism. The same thing is happening to Telluride in Colorado, which is a very expensive mountain town close to a ski resort. What is happening is that it costs $6,000 per month to rent a studio. So people who works at the resort, who works in the local shops, they cannot afford to live in Telluride anymore. So this process is happening in such an aggressive way, not only here in the US, but everywhere else, basically. And Laura can explain a little bit this process of gentrification that's happening. And the idea is to think, what tools can we deploy? They're connected to this idea of a solidarity movement, of democracy, bringing those values into our urban space and our urban planning, and what tools are already there, and sometimes you just don't connect the dots. And how can we really fortify this movement of bringing new tools and new visions, new values to the public policies that are conducting our city planning, the place most people live, right? And most people live in cities. So that's why I invited Laura, and I know I am very familiar with her research and her interests. And I think there's so much for her to share in terms of what she has been developing, even here in Colorado with the community land trusts. So I will leave her to introduce herself and her work, and then we can continue from here. And I want to make sure you all feel very comfortable to share your own projects and your own visions. Feel free to raise your hand or drop some questions at the chat. We're going to be happy to include that in this discussion. It's really just a conversation. If you're not familiar with our reader gathering, the idea is really bring in our readers and our writers and our editorial team together So thank you all for being here. Laura?
So thank you, Julia, and Elias for the invitation to this conversation. I'm very happy to be part of that. And as Julia started to say and introduce myself and her, we met I think 6 years ago, but we never really talked about research. And I have a background in architecture. I always studied low income buildings and how we would develop them. But then when I was doing my final project, during college, I got interested in, we had a slum area in our city in Brazil. And I started questioning myself, why do we have such places? We can also call them slums or informal low-income settlements. And I started connecting those dots from architecture and urban planning, especially because of this question, why do we have such places in our cities? And I did a slum renewal project within the architecture and urban design. And when I was doing that, I took a course in law in our university, and we talked a lot about urban law and how does urban law has such a strong place in our development, the development of our cities. And then I followed to my master's in urban planning. And during my master's, I study a federal program that's called Land Regularization Program, which is basically a federal program that aims to bring up to code the informal areas we have in Brazil. So Elias, your curiosity about the informal areas, that has a lot to do with my interest as well and what I've studied during my master's, especially because that was my main focus until I moved to the US, studying the favelas and studying these informal settlements in Brazil. And this federal housing program basically aims to bring this land that was informally occupied up to code. And not only that, because mainly those areas don't have proper infrastructure systems, or they don't have service provision. So this law and this program, it also aims to bring infrastructure and bring services to those areas. And I studied three case studies in our city, which is Juiz de Fora in Brazil. And the main analysis point during my research were the sense of tenure security. So people occupied the land. They didn't have any title. They didn't own the land they were occupying. And one of the surprises I had, because our program aimed really to give the land title to those people. And people felt really safe when the city brought services and infrastructure to that place. So we had a kind of disconnection in that point, land title and services and infrastructure. But at the same time, one thing that was happening in such places was the cost and appreciation was rising when the city brought services and infrastructure to those areas. And one strategy that we developed in Brazil to prevent the displacement due to the rising costs and appreciation was to tie the people to the land. So what the government was doing is they were giving the right to be in that land, to live there for those people, not necessarily the property, but they were tying that to they stay in the land. So people would receive the right to live there, but they would have to live there for 10 years. They were not allowed to move. And the housing mobility is also a key point in this discussion, because people want to move because too many reasons, okay, my kid is going to study in another city. Life happens and I want to move, and then I need to be able to move. So my main outcome from my research and what brought me into the PhD was to investigate people should have the possibility to move, but also the capacity to stay in areas where they have infrastructure and in proper like service provision. And then I moved to the US due to other personal motivations. Like my husband got a job here and at CU Denver, and then I moved here. And I decided to start my PhD. And to my surprise, Denver is the second most rapidly gentrified city in the US. So I made this connection between US and Brazil. We're having gentrification happening, gentrification and displacement happening in both countries, different circumstances, but similar outcomes. And then I started to study, I've been here for 9 months now, so I don't have a huge knowledge about the US zoning or processes, but I've studied for this past year how gentrification has been happening in the US. And I don't know if you're all familiar with the term gentrification, but I can shortly describe. It basically occurs when you have a neighborhood and this neighborhood has attractive qualities. It can be like historic architecture. Most of the times it's location. So it's close to the city center, it's close to services. And those attractive qualities make the potential value of the land high. So we have a disconnection between the current value, which is still low, and we have a high potential value that land has. So this disconnection, we call it the rent gap, and it attracts investors, and people want to move there. Not only like middle or high income class folks, but also companies and investors, they want to move to that area. And demand rises, so the prices rise even more. And with that, we displace the low income population that can't afford high rents, they can't afford the high costs of like the maintenance of their property. But that's not only it, that's a part of the gentrification process. We also have a huge changing landscape. So we have new commercial, new like business coming to town. We have that accompanies sometimes like big changes, like urban renewal projects that changes like the parks, changes many things in that neighborhood. So we have diverging research on that. So gentrification, some scholars say gentrification is beneficial for a place because it stimulates economies, it brings this whole other level of services and infrastructure. But on the other side, we have displacement of low-income population happening. So that's the bad part of gentrification. And my interest is there, basically studying the displacement component of it, really tied to the land tenure and land use of this process.
Yeah, and I just want to, I want to it just said about some people sometimes often see as beneficial this process because into individual level, for example, what happened to this apartment, it was sold probably 3 times or 4 times more than was actually worth it just a couple of years ago. So for that individual, that landlord, that was extremely beneficial, and people individually see it as a positive thing, like this area is getting more value, I will grow my patrimony. However, on a macroscopic lens, when we see what happens is that this only benefits the people who are already owners of their land, and we know historically certain groups are excluded from that process, right? So here in the US, the example, the redlining and the Black neighborhoods, but once the value starts growing in certain areas that before was not, was depleted of property value, but starts changing, in the beginning it's positive, but then you expand that marginalization process of certain families, people of color, they have to go farther and farther from their workplace to find affordable housing. And that creates an entire problem with urban mobility, like Laura mentioned, and this entire set of problems for the city that's challenged to address them. And in the city are going to build those public policies using certain lands. And who is going to benefit from those policies and how we're going to approach it? Those are the questions that are hard to answer. And here in Colorado, for example, as we're based here now, what's interesting that complements this process and causes this process of such an acute gentrification is the fact we are in one of the highest entrepreneurial dense areas. I don't know if I put that correctly, but apart from the Boston area and the Silicon Valley, I was the third largest hub of venture capital, private equity, and new businesses in technology is happening around the Boulder area and Denver because of the universities and all the, it's just a huge influx of people and businesses happening in a really short amount of time. I think it's like less than a decade now that this process has been happening such a fast pace, and that's bringing people to have to leave because they can't afford the prices, not even to buy a house, but to rent an apartment because it's the prices are just much higher than the average income of workers in the area. So, but we show that ideas like housing cooperatives, community land trusts are tools that has been explored to try to fight this gentrification process and find a way of making these people stay, workers to stay where they live, where their kids go to school, where their entire relationships are based and their families, their connections. So they are far from being ideal and perfect. And we have some problems, for example, access to capital, public policies that benefit those options, right? Legislations that enable those alternatives to grow. So it's an entire set of challenges that we have to navigate, but that's why it's so important to bring these discussions and think what can we do and what these options allow us to, how these options allow us to navigate those problems. And what's interesting among these options of housing cooperatives, community land trust, the outcomes from a very similar set of values on shared ownership, shared governance, and they deploy like a democratic centered approach where you trying to really share ownership and move a little bit away from that classic private property standard that each person should be a landlord and be a homeowner, that there are ways that you can live in a certain area without necessarily own the land or the building where you live. So those alternatives might sound still a little, experimental because we don't see them as often as we would like to. And it's hard to understand. And I think that's like why we don't see them more often, right? And comes back to that set of problems I just mentioned. But there are definitely alternatives that as a community of practice, we are trying to build here with Ownership Matters, put all this brain power to understand what are the solutions, what could we be doing? And of course, I would like to maybe open this space to people here watching as our readers to share their experiences in their own town, where you're from. We saw that Santiago is from Colombia. I'd like to hear a little bit about what is happening there where you live. We have Suzanne, who is studying also urban planning, and I'm so excited to make this connection between Laura and Suzanne because Suzanne is studying in Canada and also researching those tools in terms of urban planning. So we have Poe here. Hi, Poe. Welcome. And I would really like to open the discussion to our readers, as this is a reader gathering. It makes sense to understand what's happening. Let's start. Do you mind, Suzanne, share a little bit about what you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Suzanne, and I'm from the University of Toronto. I also work at Tapestry Community Capital, which is a nonprofit cooperative in Toronto. And what we do is that we work with a social finance tool called Community Bonds to actually build community ownership. And it was first started like 25 years ago with renewable energy co-ops. So they actually had like a wind turbine that was owned by community investors. And funnily enough, we're currently looking at expanding this tool to affordable housing. But just going back to like our, and we're working with a couple of community land trusts and actually being able to do this work. Because I think in one of the things that I've experienced through my time of living in cities like Vancouver and living in Toronto is that there is rapid loss of affordable housing stock. And it's both in terms of ownership and in terms of rentals. And I think, I forget which piece of statistics this was, but for every one piece of housing that is affordable housing that is being built, it's about 5 to 15 units being lost in Toronto. Sorry, in either Toronto or Canada nationwide. I think it differs a little bit depending on where you are, but that loss is really steep. And so what people are actually attempting to do is use solutions like community land trusts, which, as Julia and Laura beautifully put in their article, are not necessarily perfect tools, but they are helping to challenge and erode our current understandings of the private market, which I really love, actually. Absolutely. Which part would you like me to start from, Russell? Sorry, which part should I start from? If someone could give me some guidance on that, that would be great. I don't know where I
couldn't hear neither. The audio was bad on my end, but you can continue.
Okay. Well, I'll just go back a little bit. But in essence, like with the steep loss of affordable housing units that we find in cities, like the power of community ownership is that it begins to challenge the notion that it begins to challenge and erode our current understandings of private market ownership, and actually has the potential, and this is where it gets tricky, is has the potential to build real equity for real folks, which I don't know if people have been watching the meltdown of crypto recently. Like, I remember reading that and I was like, this is why we need community ownership. This is why we need real assets, like tied to real land, water, etc. Like I keep thinking about how we need to gain community ownership of like arable land, like land on which you can actually grow food, which can sustain communities on a larger basis as well, like both in urban areas and rural areas at large. Sorry, I think I'm rambling a little bit, but
it's been great.
But yeah, I think this is where the power of community ownership really lies, is erosion and also the possibility of building equity. But I think that needs to be thought through a little more carefully across community land trusts. And one of the things that I'm really hoping we can do across North America is actually get some sets of standards on what these things look like across the board, like working models of developing equity and sharing equity. Like with the community land trusts that we have here in Toronto, like Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and then Kensington Market Community Land Trust, which I know pretty well. Like that piece isn't necessarily clear because there's community governance and community ownership, but mostly for but obviously for residents, and that makes sense. But also like where the equity gets built in is not entirely clear to me anyway. But I kind of wish we had the development manager, a friend of mine by the name of Chi Tam, who helps run Kensington Market Community Land Trust, on this call because she would be amazing to help us puzzle out some of these ideas and notions. But anyway, I'll leave it there. And if there are more questions about what I do, I'll let other folks speak now. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. And you know, like if we are talking about the lack of a model, or just really how we can understand those proposals, those projects. It always goes back to the fact that cooperatives and shared governance in general, they are very flexible. We don't have like not even like an international concept of a model for cooperatives. They can look very different. It really depends and vary from case to case. And here brings something interesting about those solutions and problematic, I would say. It has both sides, it's good and bad, is that housing cooperatives, community land trusts are all attempts coming from civil society through like still private ownership, like coming from people trying to solve those problems into that specific context. But it's not a solution coming from a broader, you know, public policy. It's really coming from civil society trying to tap into those problems. But and what's challenging about that is, even though it's good, there are people and hubs in every town trying to solve to those problems locally, trying to navigate those pains, is that they can't move forward and grow those initiatives and really create like a strategy in terms of urban planning, as long as you don't have the right policies and legislation in place that really enable them to grow into a good direction and actually solve the problems they're trying to solve. Otherwise, it's always like that lonely, you know, bee trying to pollinate and really not connect to any hive. So we need to build those hives in the urban space and those connections, and see it's not just one isolated initiative that's similar to another isolated initiative, but has not that connection, that communication happening. Hey, we have this problem. That's how we solved. How you solve those problems in your area. How are the solutions you're deploying might be different, because like Laura said in her first comment, it's just this is happening on a large scale for different reasons, but very similar outcomes. And I think that's the key. The problems might be different somehow, but the solutions, the outcome can be pretty similar. And how we work to unify, like Susanna said, about collecting the data about how all these community land trusts are happening in the US, in Canada, in other places, what they have in common, how can we model them, and what solutions have been available, especially in terms of capital access to build new buildings or to restore or repurpose other constructions, right? Someone dropped in our comment, I can't remember right now, about commercial community land trusts.
Yeah,
and definitely a possibility. Yeah.
Can I just make a comment before we move to the commercial part?
Yes.
Yeah. It's just like when you were and Suzanne were talking, it's what she described from Canada. We're seeing the same thing happening here in the US. We have like federal housing policies that actually demolish low-income housing to build like mixed income housing, and then we have like 800 units in a place, they get demolished, and then we only build like 10% or 20% of it. I don't have the proper data, but that's also happening here in the US. And we have some problematic like programs within planning, like even what Elias mentioned. We love like new urbanism. New urbanism also like valorizes a lot this mix of income use and the concentration of poverty, but at the same time we're losing affordable housing and it's not getting built again. And I also had like a couple of data I could mention. Is like that here in the US since the 60s, we have like the housing price increased in 121%, while the household income increased only in 29%. So we have a huge gap and people are not being able to afford. And one of the challenges I see, like when I started studying CLTs and housing co-ops, one of the challenges I saw was like, okay, we have cities that rely a lot on property taxation. And that's one of the key things I see, not only like from coming from the government, is that cities want to bring investment, want to bring capital to the cities, want to have low or high income people living there, because then they have like a higher income, higher revenue to support infrastructure and services. So if we have a huge like area of low income people, then the taxation the city will get from that land will be lower. So talking about like community land trusts and housing co-ops and having affordable housing, we also have to talk about land financiarization and how we deal with that. And that comes to this connection between these initiatives are coming from the civil society, and we want to connect them with local governments. So we have to deal with the financial point. And I haven't studied that yet, but I know there are some cities here in the US that try to rely less on property taxation and rely more on income taxation and other forms of revenue. So those are also things to explore and talk like across different subjects and topics and backgrounds.
Yeah, and I just, guys, just keep an eye for the chat, and I just saw like interesting comments here on based on what we're discussing. Please feel free to also comment. Paul, do you want to comment, expand your comment?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a founder of a limited equity housing co-op. We just closed on our second house last Tuesday. And our product is very unique for limited equity because most of them are multi-unit buildings. And so we tried to create a model that uses single family homes. So we have 13 members and 2 single family homes basically. But it's been more challenging, I think, just getting banks like National Cooperative Bank, Amalgamated Bank. They provide those loans, but they both provided like thresholds. They were like, well, you'd have to have 40 units for us to even go to Colorado. And then we're like, okay, we have 40 units. Like there was another project that got 40 units and they were like, we're not coming to Colorado. And so there's like the people that do share loans don't want to come to Colorado, and the Colorado banks themselves are kind of like, what's this? Would anyone actually use this? So I think we're trying to just develop the market on our side and trying to figure out how to advance limited equity in different ways. My policy thing I would love to see, which has been really, so everyone is very familiar with resident-owned communities and the process that ROC USA uses to take Chase Bank's blood money, their CRA funds, and turn it into permanently affordable housing. And so I would love to see that happen in Colorado, just getting a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act for multi-unit buildings, and just see if that could if we could also develop another system like that for apartment buildings. Because otherwise I don't really know how to create, like the Mitchell-Lama program in New York was really the thing that was responsible for creating this massive influx of cooperatives along with urban blight. And so I just wonder if there's other ways of, I don't know. And everyone in Colorado is very enamored with the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act for mobile home parks. So what if we just moved it to multi-unit buildings as well?
Yes, and just want to comment on Paul's what he was explaining, just how difficult, and this is a key challenge for cooperatives, solidarity economy, all that, is the lack of information, especially among service providers. And it comes to the education and culture and the entire shift that must happen, because a lot of those service providers are so unaware of those tools, those options. that is always easier to say no to whatever is new and unconventional, unorthodox. So it's like, no, we don't work with that, or we're not interested because it lacks information. And this is, you know, coming back to the community of practice that me and Elias, we talk so much about building through Ownership Matters, is trying to educate people on in you know, just bring information and education so we can shift culturally, have the shift we need to work through those tools, because it's indeed very challenging, the lack of support from banking institutions, and just capital fighting capital. And I think a lot of what happens is because outside the solidaristic framework, we have a very short-term vision of development. So like Laura said, the city wants to attract taxes, you know, wants to raise capital for its projects. But then the way that happens on the long term ends up, you know, demanding more policies to fix what they caused with bringing all that capital without really plan how it's going to happen to the people and infrastructure that end up exploding at some point and becoming a larger problem that, yes, is going to require more money to solve. So that's just shifting. And I think that's what the solidarity lens gives us, is shifting to a long-term thinking of how we can plan in a sustainable way without thinking just all we can profit or all we can collect in terms of money right now. Any of our readers that hasn't talked yet would like to share some thoughts with us? Feel free.
I just share that on Paul's note that it's also a challenge for the CLTs itself to raise money. I know that here in Colorado, the Elevation CLT, they had to raise like almost nearly $25 million from private investors to be able to be launched, because banks are traditionally conservative, risk averse, and these new initiatives, we have like still to study them a lot and prove to them that, okay, please invest here. This is a good way to go. And I think we're lacking studies in that areas.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Elevation though was like designed from the beginning to be top-down community land trust. So like that was the whole plan, is because they're trying to create 20,000 units of affordable housing in 20 years or something. Like, so they're a very unusual land trust in my opinion. But I think they're on their way to figuring out community governance. They didn't really have that because they didn't have community. They started with money.
From money and then down.
Exactly. Santiago.
Thanks for inviting and for sharing. I learned about CLTs when I was working in co-op development in Brooklyn, New York, about 5 years ago. And I'm fascinated by the concept. I know, Julia, you asked if there was anything like that going on in Colombia. Not that I've heard of. We have a very complicated issue with land ownership as it is, as most of Latin American countries, but that's why I find CLT very fascinating for issues such as the demobilization of the armed force, guerrillas and other armed groups, where they're usually rural citizens in rural areas who need, or could find in this kind of landowner or land tenure a way to kind of resolve historical issues. Anyway, I put a question in the chat regarding legal structures and all that, because that changes a lot from country to country. And something that I found in Brooklyn to create cooperatives with immigrants who couldn't actually work, the issue. And the way they found was to create LLCs that could actually, that you could actually be a part of as an immigrant. And so an LLC could be a cooperative. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this model. And I'm just putting it out there to kind of ask the question about how there are resources regarding how CLTs can be structured with unorthodox kind of legal structures, even if there's not a legal definition in Colombia, for example, for a CLT, which I'm pretty sure there isn't. So that's kind of a question out there. Thanks for the.
Thank you, Santiago. And this is actually like a perennial dilemma when we talk about cooperatives. It's like the lack of an institutional framework that really unifies the subject brings a lot of challenges, and it can be pretty bad in terms of, into the large scope to know what we're doing, have like standardized tools to be used. But on the other hand, this lack of a homogeneous, I would say, framework also give us the opportunity of a lot of flexibility and creativity, which is what we are experimenting right now. So a lot of those community land trusts, housing cooperatives, and cooperatives of many kinds, they have been crafting their own governance tools. They have been crafting their own decision-making process that makes sense in that context. And there is a good side to that allow people to really take that governance with their own hands and see what makes sense, instead of just absorb and incorporate tools that are being designed outside, top down. But we still should have some standards that could be used and people understand what are the options on a larger scope. And in the US, this framework is even more complicated because it doesn't vary from country to country. Here is from state to state. And I think this is one of the largest challenges here, is because the legislation in terms of cooperatives largely change from state to state. Some allows multi-stakeholder cooperatives, other state doesn't allow that, or investor membership. There are like key differences from state to state. So it's definitely a difficulty in navigating such an incongruent framework in terms of legislation. Sorry, Elias, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a thought about the difference between what's going on in the US and Europe and what we might learn from South America, or actually Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, there's something I've read a little bit about called the Caño Martin Peña settlements. And they are a community land trust, and they have sort of global connections. So when Hurricane Maria struck, they were able to raise money from other CLTs around the world. But what's interesting about them also is that they are formalizing existing housing and the community stock. So it's not the same model of development as is in place in the US and in Europe. They're more like, the informal communities of, say, Brazil, the favelas, and so on. And so maybe that's something we're going to have to learn more about. I have a daughter working near Los Angeles, where there are 40 or 50,000 homeless people at the moment, to take only one city. So informality is just not an idea that most city governments can wrap their minds around and would be very reluctant to. But at least in Puerto Rico, there are working models, beautiful models of ways that can be done. And they even have a sort of approach that respects the community's social structure, social attitudes, really a much more humane way of organizing this work.
As we are approaching the last, around 10 minutes, I want to see if anybody wants to comment something else, but also drop the idea that, of course, it's so limited. It's so gatherings like that, often can't go really deep in each specific issue, but it's interesting to see what each of us is working on, have an opportunity to connect, and also to work together, right? Because this networking is part of this community of practice we're building, to opportunities of collaboration and to further continue this conversation, because the reader gathering doesn't have to stop right here. We can continue those conversations and through our peers, but also to have in mind that something we're going to release soon, more information through the newsletter, is we're working on a larger project now. Elias has been working on the Solidarity Workshop, where we are going to have the opportunity to really hopefully deepen into these discussions with a larger group and bring more details and policies, ideas that we could ideally work on a white paper of what this solidarity movement stands for. Because like, for example, the cooperatives has the International Cooperative Alliance with a set of principles, but we still don't have like a shared identity. But what are the principles and values and the policies that guide the solidarity movement at large? Because the solidarity movement includes cooperative, but it's not limited to cooperatives. So we do need to like a broader spectrum of values and understanding of what we stand here, what is our comprehension through those lenses of all these different problems. Anybody wants to comment? Court? You're still on mute.
There we go. No, I'm hi, I'm in San Francisco. I have done work with land trusts here in the Bay Area, quite a bit with the Oakland Community Land Trust, helping to get their financing together, and then sitting in as their executive director for about a year. And I've stayed in close touch with them. Two things to mention. One is that the OCLT was born out of the crash of 2008, where the community organized to put together a structure to purchase a bunch of buildings that have been foreclosed upon during that crash, and do so from a community basis, and got capital to do so, starting out through the federal government. We figured out ways to finance around that moving forward, and it's now been quite successful. The thing to mention, though, in this context, with regard to financing options, is that both the Oak CLT and the San Francisco CLT have been successful in acquisitions of, in one case, a mixed-use property, and in the other case, a large multifamily property in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, using crowdfunding. And it's just part of the capital stack. It's not the whole thing, but it's played a very important role. And it's been a fantastic way to, you know, on top of getting a multi-million-dollar bank loan, also getting a relatively small equity investment where participants in the crowdfunding instrument can be a part of the CLT for as little as $20. And it's a wonderful way to, literally democratize the financing of the project itself. And I think it's a very promising model that could have application in lots of other places.
Thank you, Cord. Yeah, and crowdfunding has been one of the main tools used for platform cooperatives and any other larger project within the cooperative world, because it allows us access to a larger pool of capital that's so hard to get outside of that. Elias, let me pass to Tony. Has been raising his hand.
He's first.
No, if Elias has a direct response, he can go for it. Great. All right, then I just introduce myself. My name is Tony Guidotti. I'm a Justice, Health, and Democracy Fellow in Harvard Safra, Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, and I lead the research on community wealth building. So this is a lovely conversation, and a lot of my research intersects with what a lot of you guys are doing. I have a panel of cities that I work with. And so I'd love to definitely be part of other conversations that you guys are having. And I've actually been jotting down notes on the organizations you guys are working with, your guys' experiences. And as we move forward with our initiative here, I'm sure I'll be reaching out to some of you just to learn more about how you innovate within your cities and how we can make that scalable.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, let's definitely keep this conversation going. Like, just this group already has so much to share with each other. Elias?
I just want to mention briefly that we ought to be encouraged by certainly at least a couple of large-scale commercial real estate projects that involve land trusts. They're not only land trusts, but I assume most people here have been keeping up with something called Downtown Crenshaw. And I met a couple of their folks last week. This is 40 acres of downtown Los Angeles. It is a Black neighborhood, and it is a Black management group, informal group that came together to put up a bid for these 40 acres. It's a mall called Crenshaw Mall. It's been around for a long time, 20 years at least, I think. And they came up with $115 million. It is the largest Black managed commercial real estate venture. It hasn't succeeded yet in American history to this point, but a land trust is a partner in that project. And if there are more of those, others inspired by Downtown Crenshaw, then there may be a bigger conversation coming for community land trust. As I think there may be also in Kansas City, just to mention another one I just learned about called Local Code Kansas City. And that is smaller, but it is 2 city blocks of a very blighted area in Kansas City that has all kinds of plans now to bring back some beautiful old kind of legacy architecture and do all sorts of interesting things. And I believe a community land trust and affordable housing is part of that project also. So there's some great stuff that's beginning to pop up in response to this situation.
Well, I want to be mindful about everybody's time, and thank you for joining, and let's keep in contact. Oh, Laura, do you want to make a final comment before we close?
No, I just remember I cut you and then we didn't comment on commercial CLTs. I don't have a whole knowledge about that, but I read a paper that talked about commercial CLTs once. And the main difference it pointed out between commercial and housing CLTs is that you can build it as a housing CLT, but instead of selling the house, you're gonna lease the structure above the land to any commercial purposes. And it's normally leased short term, which is pointed out as a great thing, because then the community that the board can also reevaluate as the city evolves, like as the neighborhoods evolves, what commercial like structure should be there and like what purposes should this land have. So it's similar, but this point is different.
I know there are commercial community land trusts happening in Alaska, which is Alaska faces its own set of problems, but they have been repurposing like old gas stations to credit unions, old like factories, furniture stores, like large, to local nonprofits. They have been using the same idea and the same kind of model to that. And I think that the community land trust, they offer a potential tool to many other sets of problems. And just briefly, me and Laura even discussed about like land protections in Brazil for community and indigenous communities, as we are facing like a huge trial in the Supreme Court about the protection or not protection of those reserves. They're threatened to not have that land completely taken by miners and farms. So we've been thinking about like the untapped potential of community land trusts, for example, to secure the land to those large indigenous communities, for instance. It's something we haven't read a lot about it, and it's something kind of not ideal at all. But as we face the possibility of the Supreme Court not protecting that land anymore, for many communities, they're trying to just hold on to the reserves built before the Constitution. Well, that's going to bring an entire set of chaos in terms of land use for indigenous communities. So one of the things we're trying to reflect, and just as an idea, if any of you are interested on that, is to think about the potential of using those tools beyond the urban space, beyond this solidarity cities, but also what that could do to indigenous communities that depend so much on their land and are so connected to that to specific regions in the country. So it's definitely something just throwing there an idea of how we can expand the community land trust discussion to different approaches and different scenarios. But thank you. I would like to thank Laura for joining me in that article and joining us into the discussion. And thank you so much for all of you to join us today.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see you all. Everybody stay well.
Thank you. Have a great
Bye-bye.
one.
Thanks. Peace.